Good afternoon again. Um, the topic that I'm going to talk about for the next while is the development of the philosophy of science. And I could put it to you in those terms. You might not find that interesting. So I'm going to do it this way. Let's just ask the question, how did we come to understanding the universe as we know it? And how do we come to understand our role in the universe as we know it? And this is a scientific view. This is not a theological view. And what I have to say doesn't in any way diminish or distort or argue against a religious point of view that is somewhat different. That's okay. You can buy that. You can. This is a view based on empiricism and science. And science is effectively that. It's a methodology for understanding the universe around us, including ourselves. And as such, science tells us things that we sometimes can't controvert, and other times we can argue about for decades and decades and decades. But here's a guy holding a ball that has a globe painted on it. I mean, remember, not that long ago, humans didn't understand that the planet was round. Not that long ago, humans didn't understand that we were biological creatures. Not that long ago, we didn't know that the planet Earth traveled around a sun, which was part of a giant galaxy, which is one of many, 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 many thousands, hundreds of thousands of galaxies. So what we know now is based on centuries of scientific work, and there's a lot more involved than I'm going to tell you. But I'm going to sort of cherry pick the low-hanging fruit, the ones that we all know their names of and what they contributed to our understanding of the world and our place in it. I'm going to start with a guy named Bishop Ussher. He was, just what it sounds like, a Roman Catholic bishop of Ireland. He was very Anglican because by that time the Roman Catholics had become Anglicans because a king made them. Lots and lots of people, especially anthropologists, find him pretty funny. In fact, there's his birthday, his date of the birthday of the world, 23 October 4004 BC. And look, the impact he's had is giant. If you ratchet back to, or if you go home this afternoon and you pull out the, Bible study books and things like that you had when you were a kid, you're going to see things like the last 6,000 years talked about as a time period. And what's before that, some religious views take it as deep time, before 6,000 years ago. It's all because of him. And look, it's not like he was right. He was about as wrong as you can get. Physicists and astronomers today generally agree that the origin of the universe is something like, very close to, every time they measure it, it's a little different, but that's okay, about 14 billion years ago. Now, really, honestly, I don't care if it's 14 billion, 14.1, 13.8. That's a really long time ago. And it's a lot longer ago than 4,000 years BC. So where Bishop Ussher said the world was 6,000 years old, it's actually, the universe is 6,000 years old. It's actually 14 billion. By any measure, he's wrong by a lot. But that said, it's not what he did, not him being right, but it's the methods that he used that were something never done before on the planet. He didn't have geology to tell us how old the planet was. He didn't have archaeology. He didn't have anything. He had the Bible. Okay, he was doing this just shortly after Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He published his book on the origins of the Earth repeatedly with changes, and the very last one was in 1565, 70 some years after Columbus, but still people were just beginning to understand the world. They just figured out, that you can go around it. And I don't think anybody had yet by 1565. It was soon afterwards that happened. But the way he did it was empiricism. He took the data he had available to him and he used it to construct a solution to the question of how long the planet existed. He presumed the Bible to be correct as written. On the first day, God did this, the seventh day he rested, and it took a week to do it. So it's more of an event rather than a long, slow process. All right, that's fine. That was a reasonable thing for him to say. That's all he knew. And then he looked through the Bible and looked at who begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, and traced genealogies and netted them together among multiple families. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see a lot of this. And he used that to figure out how long ago it was since the world was created. And his date was 23 October 4004 BC. By the way, many, many, many anthropology departments in the United States and throughout the world celebrate that birthday as a parody of how awful Bishop Ussher's work was. And I don't think it's funny because what he did was use the data available to him to construct a solution to a question. That's called science. And this also tells you that just because the methodology is scientific doesn't always mean the answer is right. Because again, he's, give or take, 14 billion years wrong. But he gave us a starting point, and nothing else existed before then. It was 50 years later, 1615, when Galileo Galilei was published his first works on heliocentrism. If you want to know what the big word means, helio means sun, and centrism means that we're centered on the sun. He basically was not the first person to say that the Earth rotated the sun by any means, because many people had been talking about that, but he was the first one to sort of promote the idea. And for that, he got resoundingly slapped. He was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. He, according to the Roman Catholic Church, spent a great deal of time in purgatory. I forget which pope, but one of the ones within my lifetime said it's okay, he can be out of purgatory now. He was actually right. We made a mistake, so he got to go to heaven. I don't understand how those processes work very clearly, evidently, and maybe no one else does either. But the important thing is he broke a paradigm. A paradigm is a lens through which we view the world. It's a set of principles that we believe in so deeply that what happens in front of us can only be interpreted one way. I would respectfully argue that Republicans and Democrats have two different paradigms, sets of principles through which they view the world. And it's kind of the old story. A Republican and Democrat are walking down the sidewalk together. That alone these days would be shocking. And they see a man, looking for handouts. And the Republican says, get a job. And the Democrat says, we need a national program for this. There's a lot of untruth in that tiny little story, but it's one that has been told thousands of times. And it's also one that tells you that no matter what equally smart people see, what data are presented to them, their views on it will differ based on their paradigms. Well, the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe was the fundamental paradigm before 1615. And this was absolutely a fascinating, complicated thing to keep up because, well, if we're the center of the universe, where are all those lights in the night sky? Well, that was thought to be ether circulating around a sphere with holes in it. And as the sphere moved about, the sky moved about. That's a depiction of it in the lower left, by the way, with the Earth in the middle, planets circulating it, and then beyond the red line is the ether. Well, and then inside the red line are a bunch of kind of lighter yellow lines. They were viewed as the spheres that surrounded the Earth and through which light came through, and that was what formed the sky, the night sky. In other words, this presumes there's a giant, outside of everything known, a giant white light coming from someplace that is penetrating holes like pinpricks in spheres, and they come down and they hit the Earth, and that's what we see in the night sky. Well, okay, but the thing is, all the stars don't move together. They move separately, different directions, because of the reality of how we exist, not because they're spheres. So at one point there had been proposed as many 27 spheres through which light would have to go through to hit the Earth for us to see the various groups of stars moving in the directions that they do. Well, this also presumes that if a light would go through the outer sphere, it somehow magically would get through the next 26 spheres uninterrupted. It was an internally illogical and inconsistent model. And by saying that it's the other way around, the Earth is going around something rather than everything going around the Earth, Galileo and his colleagues paradigmatically changed everything that everyone thought about the planet. Now, there are still flat earthers today, so maybe not everyone. Our next guest is Sir James Hutton. This is 160 years later. Well, okay, sorry, 170 years later. He was a British, they used to be called naturalists, particularly at this time, late 1700s, early 1800s. We didn't have terms like geologist, biologist, anthropologist. They were just called naturalists, people who studied nature. And he wrote extensively about a process, a principle that he called uniformitarianism. And we'd all be good to keep an eye on uniformitarianism. In essence, what uniformitarianism means is that that the processes we see in place today are the same ones that formed the planet. So therefore, processes like river erosion, ocean waves, earthquakes, volcanoes, we know those to exist today, and those must have been what formed the planet in the past. That seems pretty simplistic, but allowing that is true is really important. So you can't, as a geologist, say this happened because of some cause that we don't understand. You have to say this happened because of a cause we already understand. And if you can't do that, then you're proposing a new force of nature that's never existed before. And well, that's like saying aliens and spaceships built pyramids. It's much easier to believe humans on the landscape built pyramids because we know that there were humans, we know there are lots of humans, but we don't have any evidence for spaceships. So uniformitarianism means geology will use the processes on the planet that we know to exist to explain the geological formations of the past. Well, that is the foundation of modern geology. That is the beginning. And he didn't know it, but he was making a gigantic contribution to the future of science. Here's Hutton's theory of the Earth. I'll let you read it for a second. This is in his words. So, if you look at these things, the solid parts of the present land appear in general to have been composed of the productions of sea and other materials similar to those found upon the shores. In other words, everything we see today seems to be caused by the natural forces we already know to have been on the planet. First, that the land on we rest is not simple and original, but that it is a composition which has been formed by an operation of second causes. Let's try that a little differently. Here in East Texas, we have these reddish sandy soils, and one of the point made here is that it wasn't just formed by somebody snapping their fingers saying, I'm making reddish sandy soil here. It's here because here where we're at, it's called the Wilcox Formation, and Tyler, Texas is built on top of a Wilcox Formation outcrop, is the edge of an ancient sea. And the reason the formations we see to the south and north and west of us are the way they are is because of interaction of land and sea when this ancient sea existed. Got it. Before the present land was made, there had subsisted a world composed of sea and land. In other words, there have always been seas and land. Then we'll say, look at, hence we are led to conclude that the greater part of our land, if not the whole, had been produced by operations natural to this globe. But that in order to make this a permanent land a permanent body, resisting the operations of water, two things had to be required. Masses had to be consolidated, and the elevation had to be higher than the ocean. Huh? There you go. That's uniformitarianism. Our next guest, and then I'm going to have to pause because I have to meet with a student via Zoom, and I'll pick it up on the slide after that next, is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He's French. He was a French naturalist operating not long after Hutton. He published 16 years after Hutton, and his book was called Systems of Vertebrate Animals. And you've probably heard of it if you've been in a biology class of Lamarckian biology or Lamarckian taxonomy. And by systems, he meant a word, something that we don't use the word systems as, but as an organization or as a taxonomy or as a way to view vertebrate animals and how they're related, by how similar they are to each other. So he created this idea that there were genuses of closely related species, species that were separate from genuses, and families and so forth that were collections of related animals. And that Lamarckian concept simply was that everything and everyone is related, probably pretty distantly, but that you can look at an array of mammals, look at their bodies, their bones, whatever you want approach you want to take, and you can see that the ones that are morphologically similar, the ones that look shaped the same, are more closely related than the ones that are shaped less the same. I am going to pause here, and I will come back and add to this in a few minutes. I'd mentioned already that the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 20th century, we didn't have scientists, but we had naturalists. And one of the most famous of all of those people was a German naturalist named Alexander von Humboldt. Wouldn't be surprised if you recognize that name, because there are a lot of things named after von Humboldt. Humboldt State University, where I have friends in Northern California. The Humboldt Current along the Pacific coast of South America and North America, which brings cold waters from the Arctic up to the equator. So if you're in Ecuador and you're swimming, you're cold, not hot in the summer, because water is being moved northwards on the Humboldt Current. And this, of course, named after him. He was unlike many explorers. Most explorers, at least in my mind, do things like Christopher Columbus did. They go bug some royalty for money and support, and then they eventually get it. They get some ships, they get some men, they get some resources, and off they go. Of course, by the end of the 18th century, by 1799, you didn't quite have to do that. You could just book a ticket, which is what von Humboldt did. For 5 years, he left Germany with his partner, who was an illustrator. So many of these illustrations are his partners. I'm sorry, I can't think of his name right now, but he's French. And Humboldt explored basically South America, the Amazon jungles, climbing to the Andes. One of the things they were working on, they being those two individuals and many other people, was whether it was possible to have a worldwide flood. In other words, they were doing a scientific test of whether a worldwide biblical flood could actually occur. Could you cover the entire planet with water if you melted all the ice? And some guesstimates about the scale of polar ice caps had already come around, and there was some debate about how much of the world would be flooded. Would it all really be flooded? Well, in fact, once they measured the height of the Andes, which is what von Humboldt did, and his contribution to that multi-institutional, multinational, multi-individual research theme, then once that was done, it was quite clear that it was utterly impossible to cover the world with water, at least with the ice that exists in the water world today. Okay, that's good. But the other things that they did were to collect both both plant and animal specimens from all over the Amazon. When they were going up and down the rivers, they had a small parade of boats with samples and porters and people. By the way, if I didn't mention, von Humboldt came from a quite wealthy family. There's also von Humboldt University in Germany. It's not named after him, it's named after his brother. And therefore he could afford these things. And in fact, when they finished with their 5-year field trip, they shipped things back to Germany on 2 boats, because two ships. They didn't want to take the risk that one of them everything would be on would sink and would all be lost at once. So they split the samples, figuring, well, chances are better We still do that in almost everything we do in science today. After he was done, by the way, he was famous during this because his letters were going out and they're being published. 3 places in particular: London, New York, and interestingly, Mexico City. So when he finished his expedition, he went by ship to Mexico and traveled to Mexico City to meet the president of Mexico. He was given a hero's welcome. From there, and he stayed like a month. From there, he went to New York, same sort of thing, got a hero's welcome, and was the toast of the town for a couple of months. Then went to London, did the same thing. And then he went to Germany, where he basically spent the rest of his life publishing on the results of that 5 years of field work. The important thing about von Humboldt is that he represented a sense of empiricism, of data collecting, of not guessing, of organizing your materials in a way that it will benefit science and knowledge. And of course, his view of the current radically changed how we viewed the way the planet is constructed. Here's the Humboldt Current. You can see the coast of South America and the Humboldt Current pulling waters up to along Peru and Ecuador. I've been to Peru, and I've been in the waters in northern Peru when it's like 100 degrees outside, and they are shivering cold. But they also bring with them vast amounts of fish, particularly sardines and others, that are the foundational food of Peruvian diet. So that all of this fish that's available to people who live on a desert coast, because the west side of the Andes is the world's driest desert, the east side is its wettest rainforest, those coastal fish provided food for people 2,000 and 4,000 years before Christ, when the first Andean complex societies were created. Our next guest is Georges Cuvier. Cuvier took what Lamarck wrote about modern creatures. When I wrote Lamarck was writing about creating species names and genus names and family names, basically kind of a dendritic tree diagram of how existing species of vertebrates are created. That was his target. Well, Cuvier was thinking, yeah, that makes sense, but now we're 100 years later, 200 years later, actually. That makes sense, but what about creatures that are no longer in existence? And he studied in Paris, got his degree in France, and was interested in the fact that on the north coast, Belgium, that area, that people were finding and collecting, and he saw them in museum exhibits, weird sea animals that simply don't exist anymore, or the bones of the fossils sometimes. You understand the difference between a bone and a fossil. A bone is a bone. We all have them in here. If a bone gets stuck into something that's turning into rock, and silica moves in and replaces the bone, you have a perfect cast of the bone, but it's in rock. That's what a fossil is. So he finished his PhD. He went to northern areas, became part of a museum, or joined a museum staff, and collected sea animals from people who had them at home in collections and things like that, and from museum collections and academic collections and curiosity collections, and turned them into a big exhibit. It was called The Animal Kingdom, and went with it a book, and the book was published in 1817, and it basically pardon me, my computer was being difficult. It basically organized these extinct animals into the same kind of sort of categories that Lamarck had organized existing animals into. And there was suddenly no doubt, yeah, guess what, right? If there was no flood, thank you to Humboldt, and the whole idea of a biblical ark in which every species was on board couldn't be true, because there were thousands of extinct species were suddenly discovered. So he's challenging how we saw the universe. Suddenly we're looking at a biological view of creatures that extends not just from today's creatures, but far into the past. We still didn't know how far into the past. We didn't have a clue, okay? But helping us out was Sir Charles Lyell. He wrote a 3-volume set of my memories, right, called Principles of Geology, published in 1830 to 1833. This was after von Humboldt had been expeditioning. He took Hutton's idea of uniformitarianism and applied it to basically the geology of England. And by doing so, was able to explain things like the Precambrian mountain rocks, things like that. And his thinking was that now we have a order for the past. We have what we would call today a stratigraphy. The strata of the earth. Imagine you're looking at a picture of the wall of the Grand Canyon. You've all seen those. And there are layers after layers after layers after layers. And we intuitively and immediately today realize that they were laid down in sequence, that's a window into the history of our planet's past when you look into a situation like that. Well, that wasn't understood before, because before these principles were being applied to natural phenomenon, people would look at it and go, oh, it was made by somebody's snap of the finger just like that. Well, they're demonstrating that wasn't the case. Instead, the landscape we see today took thousands, millions of years to form, and it didn't happen in an instant of creation. It happened over a very long period of slow creation by geological forces. Well, that layered in an element of time depth that we hadn't seen before. And now we have extinct creatures. Now we have a long timeline. We have variability in existing creatures. Where do we go next to get this view? Somehow you saw this coming. Sort of the end of that naturalist period, Darwin went on a 5-year, he was 25 years old when he went, 5-year expedition with a small research vessel called the Beagle. It wasn't his research vessel, he was hired on as the naturalist. And you can see the map of where the Beagle went to and from, which is, say, a very, 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 very long ways, and spent 5 years navigating the world. In the process of that, Darwin documented life on everywhere, but particularly in islands in the South Pacific. And he noted things such as there were birds in one island of the same species as another island, and in one species they're green and the other one they're brown. And he correctly understood that that probably was because of change in the environment of the islands. The brown species island was one where the trees had been denuded by humanity. And there was, if you were bright red, you'd stand out, you could be eaten. But if you, I'm sorry, bright green. But if you were on the highly vegetated island and you're bright green, you fade into the trees and you're safe. And you realize this was simply adaptation, that creatures changed over time. And what that means, eventually, you give that change enough time, that separation enough time, then it's called speciation. It's a new species is being created. And he tested this. He collected birds from both islands. He put them in a cage. They had eggs and they had viable babies. They had new life. And by definition of a biological species, well, the definition of a biological species is if they can reproduce. And they did. They're the same species, but they're a different color. I mean, that certainly applies to us, where dark-skinned people can marry and procreate with white-skinned people. We certainly know that. It's because we're all the same species, even if we look a little different from each other. And Darwin opened the door. Darwin gets a lot of heat from people who don't understand what Darwin did. There's a wonderful book called What Darwin Did Not Know. And that's like pretty much everything. Didn't know anything about DNA, didn't know anything about the processes. But what he recognized was that the pressure on a species to adapt to new conditions can cause it to become to change slightly and then ultimately greatly. And people say, well, it's great, evolution occurred and now here we are. Well, evolution happens every single day and we are part of it, and that's simple as that. But we'll get to that another time. Here's Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. Today, and when we talk about it in class, I'll talk with you about 3 mechanisms by which change occurs in biological populations. One is the one he identified, natural selection. When a species, it's not the same as survival of the strongest, survival of the fittest is an idea that when you, is the simple idea that you lose DNA material based on not being able to survive and carry it on. So if I die because a tiger eats me, then my DNA will be removed from the gene pool, from the totality of all the genetic material of humans. But it doesn't talk about how we add it. It doesn't talk about how we change it. So we have other processes. So we talk about natural selection, we talk about mutation, and we talk about gene flow. And all of those things are real, and they're very specific biological mechanisms that those umbrella terms cover. But Darwin just began to scratch the surface. He published this in 1855. He published this shortly after hearing from a man named Wallace. Wallace was another researcher who sent a manuscript to Darwin. Darwin had 40 years of work, hundreds and hundreds of papers published. He was a very famous man after the Beagle expedition, but he never published on evolution until 1855, because Wallace sent a manuscript that came to the same conclusions that Darwin had from a different point of view. And Darwin used this as a reason to, well, I better get this out, or all my work will be lost and Wallace will have all the credit. Well, today Darwin gets most of the credit or discredit, and Wallace doesn't. So here are the mechanisms that we know to exist today. Natural selection is a means by which DNA variability is reduced because, it's not effective. If you are blind and you are walking about, you fell off of a cliff, the DNA in you would be effectively the end of the road. Mutations happen something like every 60,000 births within a species. The vast majority of mutations have nothing to do with anything negative or positive. They just happen to be trivial beyond words. Genetic drift is what happens when two populations, and Darwin proved this. He took the green bird, he took the brown bird, he put them in a cage together. They had been separated long enough for biological change to occur, in this case in colorization, but they're put back together, and now their genetic material merged. And I can't see beyond my head here, but it was meant to say, what the heck is a gene pool? And a gene pool is just all of us who biologically interact. So before 1492, you would have seen a European gene pool, an African gene pool, an American gene pool, and today those gene pools are mixed, intermingled through intermarriage and a number of other things. Here's Alfred Wallace. The wonderful thing about both Wallace and Darwin is that they both recognized each other's contributions. But when they both finally gave their results, Wallace was the unknown and Darwin was the famous guy. And they were literally booked basically back to back in the same conference where Darwin gave his paper and then Wallace gave his, and everyone was happy with Darwin because the famous guy got it, which tells you a great deal about human interaction as much as it does with science. Our field's anthropology. By the turn of the 20th century, these other sciences had emerged, fundamental principles were in place. We could really start talking about the planet as not the center of the universe, but as something that's going around a sun, that's something that's part of something bigger, a galaxy, something bigger that's a universe, that within that planet we can see biological change going on, we can understand it, we can measure it, we see geological change going on, we can understand it, we can measure it. And then comes, in deference to my dear friend Kent Riley, Papa Franz Boas. He's the founder of anthropology. Boas was an Austrian Jew, and he did his doctoral dissertation in physics at the University of Ulm in Germany, and didn't go into physics, but was hired, I'm not quite sure how this happened, but hired to do geographic field work in the Arctic. He was hired to actually show that the idea of geographic determinism was real. And what that means is, rephrasing it into a question, does the environment in which people grow up in control what kind of people they become? There was a big thought about geographic determinism at the time. Boas didn't think so. Spent a couple of years working with Inuits, Eskimos, on Baffin Island in Canada, and came to the conclusion that there was no reason to believe that they were personalities, that who they are as humans were controlled by the environment in which they grew up in. So he became the world's first anthropologist. He came to the United States, 1894. He went to the Field Museum. It was being built. And it's hard to comprehend today how impactful World's Fairs were. They're basically a dead creature now, because we have the internet. We can do things like we are now. If you wanted to learn what's new and what's different and what's exciting in 1894, you would travel from wherever you're at to Chicago to go to the World's Fair. And you would see the newest and greatest inventions. You'd see the newest science, the newest revelations of exploring, the newest everything. And you could only do it in person. And even today, where the 1894 World's Fair was in Chicago, there's a string of museums: Adler Planetarium, the Field Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, in a giant park. And all of this is because of an event that happened 130 years ago. Well, after the fair was over, and this positioned him very well because he was building the Field Museum's exhibits for the World's Fair, and he became, therefore, the voice of anti-geographic determinism. But the World's Fair ended, and he went to the American Museum of Natural History, where he took over the World Cultures Unit. By 1899, he was kind of across town, also at Columbia University, as the professor of anthropology, and he was pumping out the world's first PhD students in anthropology. He effectively created the field. And he effectively created the field on a couple of principles. One is observer participation. You, as a cultural anthropologist, don't just call people up and say, hey, what do you think about this? You go to them and watch what they do and see what they do and record what they do and learn how they behave about these things. And the other one is cross-cultural comparison. You don't look at our own culture, you look at very different cultures to see what side of a mirror that is for us. That's, in a nutshell, anthropology. Here's our next to last slide. All of the work done by the geologists in the 19th century had one problem. Nobody could tell how old it was. All they could do is take a view of the Grand Canyon, and you could see the layers, and you could say, this is older than this is older than this is older than this, but no one knew how old until after World War II. William Libby was part of the team that worked under the bleachers at the University of Chicago to build the first atomic bomb. After the war, he and his colleagues broke up, went different directions, and many of them, like he, tried to come up with, what can we do to utilize this new technology? I mean, aside from blowing up things. And his result was that once he realized that a radioactive molecule gives off a beta particle at a knowable rate, then he worked to figure out how can we take that knowable rate and apply it to figure out how old things are. And he used carbon-14. Carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon. It throws off a beta particle and it becomes nitrogen-14. The half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,000 years. So every 5,000 years, if you take a chunk of carbon-14, it'll be half as big and half as big and half as big. Well, that was the roadmap for understanding how old something is. Now, it doesn't work with rock. It doesn't work with plastic, it doesn't work with incredibly old oil. It works with things that have carbon in it, trees, plants, soils that have carbon in it, biological creatures, shellfish, human bones, all of that sort of thing. I'm talking in 2025, so the math is wrong here. Because this says 74 years, it should be 75. In honor of Libby, radiocarbon analysts declared that 1950 would be before present. So present is actually 75 years ago. That's not that bothersome. What they were concerned about was if they just said before present, if present is 2025, 2026, and I get a radiocarbon date in 2025, but I don't publish it until 2030, and say it's 74 years before present, it just would turn into a mess. So they declared BP before present to be the way they would measure radiometric assays of charcoal, wood, things like that. In other words, how to tell how old they are. So whenever you get a radiocarbon date that says 1,000 years BP, today you have to add 75 years to that. That's doable. But Libby gave us the ability to talk about how old is it. And today we have other radiometric techniques that work on different kinds of rocks and things like that. So it's not the only technique, but it covers the last 150,000 years. But we have other techniques that go back to the beginning of the planet. So now we are suddenly able to determine how old something is, which is, say I find 2 pins in 2 different places. There we go. They're sitting on a surface. I don't know if they're really both the same age or one is much, much older than the other. Now we have a way of learning these things. I'm not going to go into in this class or especially in this discussion the details of DNA, because you should all have learned this through your biology courses. But the essence of understanding DNA was published on April 25th, 1953. Not that long ago. And that's when we began to understand the structure of what makes all living things live for the very first time. And the Human Genome Project and so many other things since then have radically changed and improved how we see things. But before then, we didn't understand that. When Lamarck looked at 2 species and said, this is close to this one's further from this one, all he could do is look at the morphology, the shape, the size, the color of the creature to make that determination. Now with DNA, we can come up with a highly precise picture of how well related or closely related one species is to another. The impact on things like studies of Neanderthal and early genus Homo have been dramatic and rapid. But it all started back here 72 years ago. And really the point that I want made today is that we didn't just start 70 years ago understanding these things. We started hundreds of years ago. I start with Bishop Ussher, and 400 some years ago, and look at what we've learned since then. And it's not surprising to me that not everyone accepts scientific results, because it takes a great deal to become grounded in science to be able to understand it. And not everyone does that. People go to welding school, not science school. And that's okay. But I point out that those who go to science schools have a grasp of things that's vastly more grounded than those who don't. So that is your first lecture. Have a lovely day, and I will be seeing you at the beginning of our next module. Take care.